So, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you all had a nice lunch. We're back for our afternoon sessions. So, we have the pleasure to hear Sam Murray from Providence College and Thomas Nadelhoffer from Charleston. Actually, the other way around. First Thomas and then Sam. And it's a very, very happy occasion to have you all here. And so without further ado.
So, antes de começar, eu gostaria de agradecer a Nina, ao Thiago, ao Bruno, ao Renato, and especialmente, who's not here, ao Gabriel. Muito obrigado também para as outras pessoas que ajudaram com esta conferência e muito obrigado finalmente o público aqui online. That's online, is that right? No. So a round of applause. Thank you very much. So this is going to be a little difficult for me. Those of you who were at the talk earlier about chronic pain, I said that I've had some health problems. I was run over by a car, and so I have a bunch of plates and screws in my neck, so trying to navigate back and forth with a mic that doesn't move my head is a little bit challenging. So I'm going to have to do more staring here and less staring at you, but I don't know how else to do it, yeah? We couldn't quite get the computer hooked up here, so this is going to be half. And it's my part of the talk is going to be very text heavy. I'll do a lot of reading to try to set the stage for Sam. Okay, so I'll give an introduction first. The sort of body of experiments that we'll use to sort of frame this is going to be what they call the watching eye effect, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. Then I will say a bit about dispositionism in both folk psychology and in philosophy, and then I will talk about the literature and situationism and automaticity and empirical psychology and the relationship between all these things. So the thing that is the background philosophical debate that gave rise to the projects we're going to be presenting to you today was the rise of metaphysical skepticism, a kind of metaphysical moral skepticism about character on the one hand and agency and responsibility on the other hand. Most of the focus in the literature has been on the former, on character, and Eddie, in fact, and Dana were two of the first people to take the latter, the agency and responsibility stuff, seriously. So I'll talk about that as well. And then, so the main question we had was, do people adopt the kind of skeptical conclusions that people like Doris and Gilbert Harman and other people like that draw from this empirical literature? So if we just present people with evidence fictionalized, but still based on real studies and situational automaticity, do they tend towards the kind of skeptical conclusions that some philosophers have adopted? And across several studies, we found that the answer is largely no. No also in the sense that we have a bunch of null effects to report. And so earlier, Uri made this easier by saying, oh no, look, even in null effect cases, or maybe that was Peter, I can't remember. Even in null effect cases, those can be important. So I'm hoping, whoever said that, I'm hoping this is still true, because that's what you're gonna get out of us today. Okay, so there's a literature, it's kind of hard to believe, and I'll say a little bit about the replicate stuff, because that's gonna come up. I added a slide, so we'll come to that in a second. And so there's a body of research on what they call the watching eye effect, and it has to do with the effect that eyes in the environment, whether they're fictionalized. I could put a poster up on the wall with eyes. I could have eyes somewhere on the desk. So all I have to do is just prime you, even if you're not aware of the eyes. This can have an effect on your behavior, and there are a lot of explanations for why that might be true. So multiple studies, both in the lab and the field, have found that priming people with images of eyes can make them, among other things, not only more likely to be charitable, cooperative, and generous, but it can also make people less likely to litter and even less likely to steal a bicycle. And this, they found evidence for the watching eye effect even in very young children. Now, there's a lively ongoing debate among psychologists and philosophers, I include neuroscientists in this, about whether findings like these challenge or undermine our common sense understanding of agency and responsibility, which is really what motivated our project. All right, now, because the watching eye effect, in a recent meta-analysis, they did, some of the studies have failed to replicate, and very often when I talk to people about this research project, this is something that psychologists in particular and philosophers as well, they're worried that there's been a problem in replicating some of the more high-profile priming studies. And so the question is, well, then why should I care about any of this? If it turns out these priming studies don't replicate anyway, then maybe we shouldn't be so concerned. And I'm just going to read Doris's way of trying to respond to this because I think it's largely right, and I want to have it on the table so that I can maybe preempt some questions later. So he says, when the dust of Replicate has settled, some currently venerated findings may be less venerated, and some currently commonplace research practices may be less commonplace. But we're talking about an extensive and variegated field, and it's not easy to predict what the casualties will be and what forms retrenchment will take. Norms requiring larger sample size and all this stuff that we're already doing. Priming effects range over perception, behavior, and motivation, and in each domain, effects vary with both individual differences and situational variation. With this much diversity, indiscriminate statements like priming studies have been challenged don't mean very much. Difficulty with one priming study does not entail difficulty for all studies in its domain, and difficulty with priming studies in one domain does not entail difficulty for all priming studies. Still less does difficulty with priming studies entail that all experimental psychology is in the soup. So I just want to say, the odds of, I think there's enough evidence for priming to be comfortable that it's a real phenomenon, even if some of the more famous priming studies may fail to replicate. Okay, so here's an example just from sort of our ordinary lives. This is Jenny out marching to protest, speaking truth to power. And so going back to Skinner and certainly Ross and Nisbet in psychology, there's this idea that our common sense way of thinking about our own agency relies heavily on sort of two core assumptions that are related. On the one hand, we explain our behavior in terms of dispositional traits. So Jenny, in this case, Jenny told the truth in the face of possible personal repercussions because she's a courageous and honest person. So the character traits, we appeal to character traits in order to explain people's behaviors. We think they have explanatory value. And part of the way that character works, going back to Aristotle, involves practical rationality, because part of what it means to be virtuous is to have the practical wisdom to look at all the options and do the thing that virtue requires. These things go hand in hand. So in explaining Jenny's behavior, we appeal to character traits. We take them to both be causally robust, and more importantly, for our purposes, to be cross-situationally stable. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second when we get to some quotes from Aristotle. So we take these dispositions to translate into action, even in difficult situations with high stakes, like Jenny protesting. And in explaining ours and others' behavior, we tend to appeal to internal motivational, epistemic, and volitional variables rather than environmental variables. This is maybe a little bit more complicated than this because it will depend on the valence of the action. So if I've done something that's not good, and then I'm caught, I'm going to explain my having done something not good in terms of the environment. But if I did something good, I'm going to explain it in terms of my dispositions. But if you do something good, I'm going to write it off on the environment. If you do something bad, I'm going to blame it on your disposition. So there's an asymmetry in how this plays out, but it's a version, it's in the ballpark of what Nisbet and Ross called the fundamental attribution error. And in some ways, the projects that the studies Sam and I are going to talk about today was an attempt to see how fundamental the fundamental attribution error was. Like, how hard is it to get people to move away from this kind of dispositionist thinking? And it turns out it was harder than I'd hoped, harder than I expected, but that's the way it goes sometimes. So just as there is the sort of attachment and commitment to dispositionism in our ordinary lives, maybe not surprisingly, there's been a focus on character traits and virtuous traits in the philosophical literature on moral agency. So both ancient and contemporary virtue ethicists have made character the centerpiece of their ethical theories. So here's Aristotle. According to Aristotle, virtuous character is firm and unchangeable, and hence virtuous agents never knowingly or intentionally behave viciously, and that they do what virtue requires, even in the most demanding and difficult scenarios. And so one question is this picture psychologically realistic? Is this a psychologically realistic model of moral psychology, actual moral psychology, not theoretical philosophical psychology? Now, I got to back up for this. So on the one hand, like I said a minute ago, there's an intimate connection between virtue theory and virtue ethics on the one hand, and this appeal to virtues to explain behavior, and our practical wisdom or practical rationality. So this is from the philosophical literature on morality. So we're going from sort of folk morality to the ethical theorizing. So Brink, 2013 claims that, what does he claim? That responsibility requires, quote, that agents not simply act of their strongest desires, but be capable of stepping back from their desires, evaluating them, and acting for good reasons. Manuel Vargas, right around the same time, similarly claims that responsible agents possess a suite of basic agential capacities implicated in effective self-directed agency and are also possessed of the relevant capacity for detection of suitable moral considerations and self-governance with respect to those considerations. Okay, so let's go back to the watching eye effect. So, despite the central role played by character and practical reasoning in common sense morality and in ethical theory, there is a large body of empirical research in psychology that paints a very different picture of human agency. So the watching eye effect is just a case in point. We tend to think, when we're reflecting on our own behavior and the behavior of others, we tend to think the behavior like charitable donation, refraining from littering, or certainly refraining from stealing a bicycle, those sorts of behaviors stem from compassion or conscious concern or internal moral conscience or something like that, rather than something that's in the environment that you may not even be aware of. And yet, the whole point of the watching eye effect and other findings like it suggest that maybe that's not the way human psychology operates. Now, I picked a lot of quotes, partly because I wanted this to be appeal to both philosophers and psychologists, but it was also because I know I have a tendency to speak way too fast, and having all this to read is slowing me down. So I hope that makes it easier for those of you who are being tortured by my rapid English. Okay, so this is from B.F. Skinner from 1971. By questioning the control exercised by autonomous man and demonstrating the control exercised by the environment, a science of behavior also seems to question dignity or worth. A person is responsible for his behavior not only in the sense that he may be justly blamed or punished when he behaves badly, but also in the sense that he is to be given credit and admired for his achievements. The scientific analysis shifts the credit as well as the blame to the environment, and traditional practices can then no longer be justified. Now, this is what we're finding. I think what we find in these studies is a lot like what Skinner says right here, and Barge is going to say something similar in a second. He says, these are sweeping changes, and those who are committed to traditional theories and practices naturally resist them. I think the resistance is even stronger than Skinner may have anticipated. So this is, jumped into the future 30 years. This is Barge from a paper, widely cited paper called The Automaticity of Everyday Life, and he's just placing himself on the shoulders of Skinner, and he's going to go from what we normally talk about in situationism, and he's going to tie it to automatic, unconscious, non-conscious processes. So he says, as Skinner argued so pointedly, the more we know about the situational causes of psychological phenomenon, the less need we have for postulating internal conscious mediating processes to explain those phenomenon. Now, as the purview of social psychology is precisely to discover those situational causes of thinking, feeling, and acting in the real or implied presence of other people, it is hard to escape the forecast that as knowledge progresses regarding psychological phenomena, there will be less of a role played by free will or conscious choice in accounting for them. In other words, because of social psychology's natural focus on the situational determinants of thinking, feeling, and doing, it is inevitable that social psychological phenomena will be found to be automatic in nature. That trend has already begun, and it can do nothing but continue. Now, this is a paper, a very widely cited paper by Barge and Chartrand. This is actually the title of, we are playing on this title of our talk. They called it The Unbearable Automaticity of Being, and if what Sam and I have found is to be trusted, it turns out that people find it a lot more bearable than the psychologists thought. So we can bear it. Turns out people are happy to take this on board. So here's a couple passages from that. Our thesis here is that most of a person's everyday life is determined not by their conscious intentions and deliberate choices, but by mental processes that are put into motion by features of the environment and that operate outside of conscious awareness, and guidance is a difficult one for people to accept. Given one's understandable desire to believe in free will and self-determination, it may be hard to bear that most of daily life is driven by automatic, non-conscious mental processes, but it appears impossible from these findings that conscious control could be up to the job. As Sherlock Holmes was fond of telling Dr. Watson, when one eliminates the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Okay, so that's the sort of very quick overview of the literature from philosophy, the literature from situational psychology, some of the literature on automaticity, and then philosophers really starting with Harman in a paper from 1999. He's going to use this situationist psychology to try to problematize some of the core assumptions of virtue ethics, especially the kind of virtue ethics you find in Aristotle. So he says, on this occasion, I discuss a different kind of rejection of folk morality, one that derives from contemporary social psychology. It seems that ordinary attributions of character traits to people are often deeply misguided And it may even be the case that there is no such thing as character, no ordinary character traits of the sort people think there are, none of the usual moral virtues and vices. Now, Doris has a much more modest, I don't know about Doris is a modest view, but it's a much more moderate view than this one, but I think this gives you the flavor of how the skepticism works. Now, this is two pieces from, one from Eddie and one from Dana, who, Eddie's here, Dana was here a couple days ago. So they were the first to really start worrying about not so much character and the relevance of situationist psychology to character and whether we have it and what it's like, but more to this question of practical rationality and the role that reason's responsiveness and a kind of practical wisdom plays in our normal metaphysical theories of agency. So Eddie points out that while we normally take ourselves to be self-controlled creatures who can, quote, deliberate to reach some consistency among our competing desires and values, the gathering findings on situationism and automaticity potentially call our autonomy into question by showing that, quote, we do not govern our behavior according to principles we have consciously chosen. Now, Eddie's not a skeptic, you already know this, so he's not pushing us in a skeptical direction, but I think that one of the important things, I won't say one of the few things Eddie and I agree about, but one of the important things that he and I agree about is that determinism is probably, for both of us, less of a worry than the findings from empirical psychology like this. And if nothing else, the way that determinism is often presented, either determinism is true and we have free will or we don't. We treat these things as binary. And indeed, what you might think in looking at the literature on situationism automaticity isn't that we don't have free will, I would say that, but you might just think we have less free will than we thought. We have less autonomy than we thought. We have less control than we thought. We have less access to the things that drive our behavior than we even imagined. And so in that sense, it's a challenge to agency, even if it's not the kind of challenge that would have like global implications. At least that's how I think that's how I would read Eddie. And in that sense, he and I agree. I wouldn't call it free will. I would just talk about agency, but I think we will largely agree about that. Now, Dana had something very similar to say. She said one way of seeing the situationist cases, or at least some of them, as troubling is this. Simply put, the subjects seem to be acting for bad reasons, or at least not acting for good reasons, and this is really the important part, and they seem stuck doing so. At the same time, having the ability to act for good reasons is essential to freedom and or moral responsibility. Okay, so our project was an attempt to get from the metaphysics of morals back to moral psychology. We examined whether presenting people with evidence for situationism and automaticity influences their attributions of agency and responsibility in the way that skeptics might predict. To test this, we presented people with lightly fictionalized versions of experiments from the empirical literature, and as we'll now discuss, across 4 vignette-based studies, we found that participants do not tend to draw skeptical conclusions about agency and responsibility in the face of evidence that our moral behavior is more strongly influenced by environmental stimuli and automatic processes than we may have traditionally assumed. So that was the project. And now I don't have my slide with the survey says. That's okay, Sam. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sam. He's going to do the hard part of talking about all the null effects.
Okay. I'm also, since I don't have a proper start, going to piggyback on what Thomas said. Thanks to Gabriel, thanks to Tiago, Bruno, Karina, and other people that I'm forgetting for setting this up, for inviting me, for inviting Rose, and it's been really interesting so far to get to see what everybody's been doing down here. Okay, so just as sort of a rough transition between my part of the talk and Thomas's. Okay, so up at the very top you can't see this, but as a way of summarizing what Thomas was saying, if the skeptics are right about how people are going to react to these sorts of cases, these sorts of experimental findings, then what we should find is that when people are confronted with empirical evidence of automaticity, situational priming, whatever you want to call it, then that should diminish attributions of freedom and responsibility within those contexts, but only if 3 conditions are met, right? So the first of these is that what we should find is that when people are presented with these experiments, that what they'll do is they will identify the relevant situational cue or prime as the primary cause of behavior. So when you ask them, what caused this person to do what they did? Cheating, helping, whatever. They should say, oh, it's that poster, right? It's the picture of the eyes, right? So they should pick out the prime as the cause. The second thing that should happen is that they should understand that the individuals who act on the basis of these primes aren't aware of them. Right? So it is that the poster is the cause of behavior, but the person's not aware of it in the room. Right. One experiment we talked about, say, like a person finds a dime on the top of the payphone, and so they're in a more helpful mood, right? But they don't understand how the dime is causing their behavior in that way. And then finally, people should understand that individuals who are caused to behave on the basis of reasons or forces that they aren't aware of would explicitly disavow that if they were told. So if you went up to someone and said, the only reason why you didn't cheat is because there's a poster on the wall of eyes, the person would go, no, that's not why. I did it for some other reason. So there should be this disavowal associated with it. So we just wanted to see initially, is that actually how people react to these kinds of experiments? So we collected data from, or we analyzed data from 324 participants on MTurk. I'll say this now because we did all these experiments on MTurk. I know now that there are some concerns about the quality of data that's collected on MTurk. I want to say that Thomas and I put in place a bunch of exclusions related to how quickly people did the survey. We had a lot of comprehension checks. So when I say we analyzed data from 324, I think we collected 850, 900 responses and threw most of them out. So let that be a lesson to maybe move off of MTurk to Prolific or something else. But these are, we're reasonably confident these are 324 quality participants on MTurk. Okay. And this was that we gave them a couple different situations, as Thomas mentioned, lightly fictionalized versions of experiments that are sort of prominent in the situationist literature. So here's one example. After providing consent, participants would read this sort of vignette. There's gathering evidence from psychology that human decision-making and behavior are influenced by factors of which we are not consciously aware. In a recent study, Robert Bard and colleagues at Yale University subliminally primed participants in the experimental condition, but not in the control condition, to think about the importance of achieving one's goals. Participants were then asked to perform a task that required them to identify and write down as many words as they could, based on a set of 7 Scrabble letter tiles. A few minutes later, they were told over an intercom to stop. Hidden video cameras recorded the participants' behavior throughout to see how many of them continued to search for and write down words after they were told to stop doing so. Whereas only 21% of the participants in the control condition cheated, more than half of the participants in the achievement condition ignored the instructions to stop. John was a participant who was subliminally primed to think about the importance of achievement goals. He cheated in the experiment. Now, participants either saw sort of this version, this is the experimental version, or a control version where they were told about a participant in the control condition of this. So some of this varied. Okay, so we were interested in a couple different things. So based on our primary hypotheses, we first asked people, what caused John to cheat? And this was an open response. Yeah, right. I thought people were kind of excited to see if I was going to fall off the stage. Keep people. Yeah, right. So first was just an open text box. What caused John to cheat? And then after that, we said, okay, now think about the answer you just gave to this response. Think about what you just typed. Was John aware of the primary cause influencing his behavior? 1 to 9, not aware to completely aware. And then a vowel. If you told John the primary cause, right? If you told him about that thing you just typed about before, of why he cheated, would he believe you or not? We also asked them just some standard questions about freedom, responsibility, and character. So to what extent does John have free will? To what extent is he blameworthy for cheating? And is John a dishonest person? And actually, this reminds me, I should also say, we varied. So some of the experiments described cheating behavior, bad. We had an equal number of vignettes that described good behavior, helping some kind of pro-social behavior. So it would either be, is he blameworthy? Is he praiseworthy? Is he an honest person? Is he a dishonest person? Is he selfish? Is he good? Right. So it was a mix of positive or negative depending on condition. And then one of the things that we wanted to kind of control for was, well, look, maybe the people who read this kind of know some of the replication problems. So they, read some, Wired article recently saying like, yeah, all this stuff is bogus. So to say, okay, let's try to catch those people out and say, do you think that a study like this is reliable? Whatever they happen to mean by a study being reliable. And initially what we found, what we did was we first went through all the open responses and sorted them into different categories, right? So roughly situational and internal were the ones that we plan to do. And then throughout the course of coding the responses, this kind of third category emerged. It was a mix of the two. It wasn't enough to do any interesting analyses with, but we still wanted to account for them. So an example of an internal response is something like this. For instance, I have no idea if I had to guess because he's a good person, not because of any dime bullshit. Okay, that's like straightforward, paradigmatic, internal response. The situational ones, these were much more cordial, matter-of-fact, business-like responses. He was primed to think it was important to achieve a goal. That's why he cheated. And then a good example of a hybrid one was people saying, well, look, he was put into a good mood because he found the dime. Seeing this interaction between the situational cue and some kind of internal state. Now, as you'll see here, that the green bar is the proportion of these hybrid responses. So as I mentioned before, there weren't enough to do anything interesting with them, but they were there in most of the cases. And I should point out, let's see, here we go. Achievement and Samaritan are bad. So the Samaritan is the person who walks by, the individual who's distressed on campus because they have to get to an important meeting. Achievement is, they're told like achieving things is important, and then they end up cheating because they want to do well in their assignment. And then gods and phone are good examples. So there's some religious themed poster that caused people in the experimental condition to be more helpful. And then the phone one, that was where a person found a coin on top of a payphone and then was more likely to help somebody who had dropped a bunch of papers on the sidewalk. So evenly split between good and bad outcomes. And the interesting thing here is, right, so you can see the internal responses are, higher for some of them, but, good, bad, like there's no obvious pattern where it's like the good ones get more internal and the bad ones get more situational. It's kind of split. And when we run what we did was we found no evidence for a difference in the proportions across the conditions, some trends, but they don't hold up after correcting for multiple comparisons. But then we also wanted to see, well, let's try to figure out especially for God's phone and Samaritan, are the selection of internal or situational kind of above the chance point. So we ran these one sample proportion tests against a 50% marker as the chance point, and none of them end up being significantly different from that chance point. I think the closest we get is in God's, but notice that that's because it's a preponderance of the internal reasons. So people are looking at these and they aren't really selecting the situational factor as the cause of behavior when we describe these experiments to them. So say, okay, that's fine. On balance, it looks like about half, maybe 2/3 of the people aren't getting what we're telling them. But what if we isolated on the people that did, in fact, pick, right? Like, what if we isolated on the people who are in those blue bins across all the things? Maybe their responses would sort of align with what the skeptics predict in terms of attributions of awareness, disavowal, etc. And we don't find it. So the red line, the legend doesn't really show up well on the screen. The red line are people who selected an internal reason, and the blue line are people who selected a situational motive. On the left is awareness, on the right is avowal. And the important thing to notice here is there's no difference. There's no difference in terms of the awareness that's attributed to the person. It's attributed to acting on the basis of the cue. So for example, when we talk about the person who's primed to think about achievements, people say, well, look, okay, that guy was primed to think about achievements. That's why he cheated. But then those people are just going to turn around and say, but yeah, that person was aware of how that prime was causing him to behave. And they thought, yeah, if you told that guy, he would probably accept that that was the reason why he cheated in that experiment. So we're not really finding any difference between these internal and these situational motive types in terms of how people think about awareness and disavowal. Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah, I mean, with the confidence intervals, and yeah, I think these are standard errors. So it's, yeah. Yeah, those were the models that we ran on these. So we were controlling for reliability in each case. And then we looked at the attributions. And again, so these are standard errors. So even though there are these differences, none of these end up being significant differences when you correct for multiple comparisons. So same level of free will, same amount of responsibility, same amount of diagnosticity across these motive types. Right? So whether a person is seen as acting on the basis of an internal motive or some internal feature of themselves, or acting on the basis of a situational cue, people are saying, look, there's the same amount of free will, same amount of blame, same amount of praise, same amount of indication as to whether this is a good or bad person. So, okay. Actually, well, no, sorry, that's incorrect, because in this first study, we did start to see some trending effects of these. So we thought, okay, look, we're not finding the stuff that we expected in terms of awareness and what motives they pick, but at least we're picking up maybe on some differences in attributions across these different motive types, which sort of prompted us to keep going with this. So I started out with 3 predictions. That if the skeptics are right, then we should see diminished attributions under these conditions, right? So people will pick up on the situational cue as the primary cause. People will understand that individuals aren't aware of the influence of the situational cue, and they would disavow it if they were made aware of that causal influence. And for all 3 of these, right, we don't find any support for these predictions. So, Thomas and I were talking about these. We thought, well, what does this mean? And eventually we kind of stumbled on this idea of like, well, maybe what's going on is, because, we've done these other studies showing people don't understand determinism. There's other kind of criticisms of X-Phi where it's like maybe people don't understand the stimuli in a way that philosophers want them to. So we thought, maybe it's that people don't get the experiments that we're giving to them. Like people aren't trained to read kind of summaries of experimental results. So look, they're just not getting it. And one of the issues with those original vignettes was we left it open-ended what was in fact the cause of the behavior. And in fact, we left a lot of the kind of situational aspects of the experiment open-ended or up for participant interpretation. Maybe if we made those things explicit, then participants would get it, and then we'd find support for these predictions. The other possibility that we floated was that maybe this is tapping into some kind of cognitive bias. That people are getting these experiments, but then they are making attributions that don't align with the skeptical predictions because they want to preserve their sense of agency, their sense of free will, the sense of responsibility. So that, okay, look, what we can do is let's make this stuff explicit. And if we find the same pattern of responses that we did in this first experiment, that would be pretty good evidence that we're dealing with a bias. Because people would be picking up on the influence of the prime, but still not seeing any difference in terms of the awareness, in terms of the attributions of free will, different kinds of agential attributions. Then I thought, no, but if they get it and then we find the differences, then we can see that the results of this first study was driven just by participant misunderstanding. And one of the things that put us onto this was a different study we ran, which was kind of upsetting when I looked up when this actually got published. It was a year ago, almost to the day, which I didn't realize we had been working on this project for as long as we have. But anyway, in a different study, Thomas and I had found some evidence for this kind of defensive thinking and these cognitive biases, not with respect to free will, but with respect to responsibility. So as a quick summary, I won't go through the whole result, but what we found was when we presented people with these kinds of vignettes, people who had a high sense of personal control. So we just asked them, how much control do you think you have over what you do and what you think? People who had a high sense of personal control were much more surprised at the results of these experiments and ended up attributing, I think this must, that negative on there is incorrect. Sorry. The negative is correct. So people who had high personal control ended up being more surprised, and on that basis would attribute lower free will to people. On the basis of this, you think, okay, that's what we would expect if you came to appreciate how much of our behavior is driven by unconscious influences. You would attribute less free will to people. But we find the opposite pattern for responsibility. So people who have a high sense of personal control, they're more surprised at those experiments, but then they end up attributing more responsibility to people who cheat or to people who help in these experiments. And our interpretation in the paper, I mean, you can read this if you're interested, or talk to us about it if you're interested but don't want to read the paper. We say, well, this is evidence for a kind of defensive thinking about responsibility. So this is what got us to think about, well, maybe there's a bias operating here. So in the second study, we analyzed data from 138 participants. And it was the same as study 1, except all the things that were left hidden in the description of the experiments was made explicit. So we told them, look, the subconscious prime is the thing that causes the behavior. And the person isn't aware of the subconscious prime as they're acting. And when the experimenters debriefed them afterwards, they explicitly told the experimenters, I don't believe you that this was the thing that caused my behavior. So we packed all of it in there. And then we also developed these control conditions for each vignette that didn't mention priming. Just said, here was a person that did an experiment and then they cheated. Or here was an experiment and then they helped. Nothing about any situational prime. And it worked. So again, we had people give these open responses about the reasons. What we found was when we gave them these experimental vignettes that described the operation of a situational prime, 75% of the people picked out a situational motive. Right, so significantly more than people who did an internal motive. The control vignettes, people picked significantly more internal motive attributions. Not picked, they produced them themselves. These were open text response boxes. So it looks like people were picking up on these explicit features of the scenarios. Very good news. We were like, all right, we figured it out. This is it. And then, yeah, still no difference. So when you split them by the motive attribution, still no difference in the attribution of awareness. So people still think, oh yeah, the person is highly aware of the causal influence of the situational factor, and they don't disavow it. So a very similar pattern of responses to study 1. So on the left, those are the control experiments that don't describe priming. These right ones here are the ones are where participants are looking at an experiment that describes a situational prime. And so you can see here, yeah, no difference between the control and the experiment, and no difference between which motive the person selected or produced. So, yeah, what we do, let's just, bad news. Did not hold up with the predictions. Even more, some of those nice trends that we identified in study 1, the effect of motive type on different attributions of free will and responsibility, character, all disappeared, all gone in study 2, which I don't think either of us were surprised about. So, yeah, sorry. So at that point we thought, okay, it seems like we're dealing with a kind of cognitive bias that people have, where even though they seem to be interpreting the experiments correctly, they're still not showing any of the changes in their attributions of agency that we would predict if they were correctly interpreting these experiments. So then we thought, okay, maybe what's going on is the prime isn't strong enough. So what we did was, thought, well, what if we strengthen the prime? We did another study. We just took 2 vignettes this time, not 4. One good, one bad. And what we did was we varied the strength of the prime by altering the number or the proportion of participants who ended up acting on the basis of the prime. So in one version, it was like 92% of the people who got the achievement speech ended up cheating. In another one was 52% of the people. In another one was 35% of the people. Always compared with the 21% baseline in the control condition. So we thought, look, surely if we say like this situational prime is so strong that almost everybody is cheating or helping on the basis of it, and they're not aware of that this is happening, maybe then people will think, okay. Now I sort of understand that these people are operating on the basis of subconscious influences. I'm going to diminish my attributions of free will and responsibility, and we don't find that. So this is split by the probability type, high, low, moderate, and you see here, no difference in terms of the amount of the free will and the responsibility that's attributed across either vignette. So the achievement vignette, that's the cheating behavior. The gods vignette, that's the helping behavior. No difference between the two conditions or the probability levels. So it looks like varying the strength of the prime doesn't really have any effect. So then we wanted to do, first we were sort of nervous because we were just coming up with null effects. Like, this is making us uncomfortable. So we thought, we at least want to keep replicating this to assuage some of the worries people have about just, getting on with nulls. But we also wanted to add some real world cases. And then we threw in a question about causation just to kind of we needed something to say, so we had to start exploring different stuff. So we added this cause question where if people saw a vignette describing somebody who was primed to act in a certain way, we asked them, okay, did being subliminally primed to do this condition-dependent behavior, did that cause John to cheat? If they were just in the control condition where they don't get any information about a prime, we just said, well, to what extent did John's decision cause him to cheat or to help, or whatever the situation demanded. And then we want to test another thing. So we thought, okay, maybe it's not that these one-off studies are the sorts of things that could dislodge a belief in free will or responsibility. Maybe it's that people have to appreciate the magnitude of the results. So it's not just here's this one experiment that one guy did and it turned out this way, but like here are all these different experiments that people have run that support this idea that our behavior is largely under the control of these situational influences. So we gave him this short passage from Doris's Talking to Ourselves book, where he kind of goes through this thing of like, look at all these different places where like important decisions seem to be, influenced by these situational factors in ways that we were to find totally surprising. We thought, well, maybe once they appreciate that, we can start to move around their attributions. So we won't do the whole thing, but he just says, look, and this I think is an important part here. He says this is a suggestive run of laboratory studies, but what about real life? Well, here's this study where people took Social Security records, and they showed that like they've got these implicit egotism effects that are associated with people who want to move to states that match their name. So like women named Virginia are more likely to move to the state of Virginia in the United States. Women named Georgia are more likely to move to the state of Georgia. And Doris's conclusion is like, this is just the sort of thing where it's like people are making important life decisions on the basis of like very minute details that don't really seem to constitute a good reason for making a decision. Anyway, so that was the idea. They just packed in a bunch of studies, shortly described them in a kind of Doris type of, entertaining for an academic way. Still, we find nothing. So start with the people who just read the vignettes. What we find is no difference, no significant difference in the attribution of free will, responsibility, or character, depending on whether people read a control vignette with no prime, or they read a vignette that described the influence of a prime. So again, coming up null. Okay, so then we started splitting stuff to sort of explore, like, well, what's going on? Maybe it's like a lab life distinction, like Doris was saying, right? So maybe, like, let's take the situations where we describe stuff that happens in real life. So one of these examples was, in the United States, when you get a driver's license, in some states, the default option is that you're listed as an organ donor, which just means, this is Brazil, is it? Okay, so, yeah, in some states, the default option is an organ donor. In some states, the default option is to not be an organ donor. Lo and behold, that default option has a big influence on the number of people who are organ donors in your state. That's a real-life example of a situational influence. So we said, okay, let's bin those together, and then we'll bin the lab stuff together and see if that, see if we can start to get a difference there. As you see, when we split lab versus life, we're not really getting any interesting variation. And there's also no sort of outcome or valence difference either. Like, it's not like, well, for good stuff that's in real life, we'll start to see a difference, or bad stuff. And then the final point was just exploring, like, well, what about when people read about a bunch of different stuff? Again, nothing. Now, there's more stuff that we could do with the Doris stuff, but just as a first pass, that wasn't really turning up anything interesting either. The only thing that we found was the following, which turned on the cause question. So what we found when we asked people about causation was that there is an effect on attributions, but only when people are describing non-primed decisions. So when you give people vignettes that just describes behavior, nothing about a subconscious prime, nothing about awareness, anything like that, then causation makes a difference to how people attribute free will. So when they're evaluating conscious decisions, they see behavior as more free the more it's caused by the decision. But when you tell them about a subconscious prime, makes no difference, right? So the more they see the subconscious prime as a cause of the behavior, makes no difference to the attribution of free will. But they treat decisions differently. And that's kind of what, I mean, the place where we're at now is we say, I guess that kind of makes sense if you're a common sense dispositionist. I mean, think, look, what we care about are the causal influence that our decisions have on our behaviors, and people just don't care about these situational primes. And that's part of the reason why we think people aren't really threatened by the experimental results, because they're just being told about stuff that they don't care about from the perspective of evaluating people as agents. Right, yeah. So there's the text version of what I just said. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Some conclusions. Common sense dispositionism is very sticky. How do we know this? We presented you with the results of 4 experiments, and I think we've probably run about 11. We've probably collected data from, I don't know, we've probably analyzed data from more than 5,000 people at this point. And all the same, null results all over the place. And whatever significant results we find don't ever hold up in the subsequent studies that we run. So it's very hard to move people off of this, this assumption or belief that they have about the causes of action. Okay, that's fine. Well, yeah. I can only sustain this kind of, presentation mode for so long. So one thing that we're sensitive to, which is partly a result of some of the pushback we got on our free will work a couple of years ago, is this idea of well, look, I mean, here's one simple explanation for all of this: is you're giving these scientific results, even though they're fictionalized and sanitized, and they're relatively simple experiments to understand. They're still scientific experiments, and that's just not what people that's not what people do. Right? They don't have facility for understanding this stuff or digesting it. And so it's participants don't understand. If they really understood the implications of these experiments, then they would change how they're attributing free will and responsibility. Then we sort of see it. And our issue with that response, roughly, is that then that changes the skeptic's argument. So if that's the response, that look, if participants really understood these experiments, then they would be more skeptical. We say, well, okay, but then it's not the results of the experiments that challenge people's common sense beliefs and views. It's the experiments or the results under a particular interpretation. But then our thinking is, okay, but then it's really the interpretation that's driving the skeptical argument here, and not really the particular results. So there are 2 things that we have to say to this. One is, it's a matter of some controversy how to, in fact, interpret the results of these experiments. So there's some people, so Christian Miller, from 10 years ago, has a bunch of different interpretations of the experiments where he says, yeah, look, there's not really any reason to worry about these experiments. Even if we think that they're reliable and that they're going to replicate, they don't really have the implications for our agency that people think they do. And then recently, Liad Mudrik and some colleagues published a paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences making roughly the same argument. So that's one thing, is just the interpretation is a matter of some controversy. But again, the idea that the interpretation is what matter means that it's not really the results of the experiments that should challenge it. It's the interpretive framework that then sets how to think about these results. But then that's the thing that's doing all the work. So I won't go into this too much because it's, I think, a little bit adjacent to the argument of this paper. But you might think this is a similar kind of concern that Salim Burker raises about how to interpret the Josh Green experiments. It's there's all these normative assumptions packed into how to properly interpret these experiments. But then it's those normative assumptions that are going to drive the skepticism, not anything about an empirically driven skepticism. So we think this is not really the right way to explain away, or to try to give an explanation on behalf of the skeptic to these results. And what was the other? Yeah, this is something that we've been playing around a bit. Now that we're at the end of doing some of the studies on this, we think, look, maybe the right way to read these results is to say that the way people think about free will and agency is not beholden to empirical discovery. So it's not like people have views about free will and responsibility, but they think, well, if the science turns out a certain way, I'm going to have to change it. They just think, no. My commitment to free will and responsibility is fundamental, and I'm not going to give it up no matter what the scientific worldview is, and I'm just going to adapt how I think about free will and responsibility to sort of fit with whatever the scientific interpretation of the world is at the time. So I think it's the wrong way to think about it's a wrong way to think about the nature of these beliefs or the nature of these, let's just stick with belief, the nature of these practices, maybe, if that's the way you want to think about it. It's the wrong way to think about them, that people are sort of gambling on the science, vindicating these beliefs in the long run. The analogy here, and I'll close with this, I think the analogy is the way that people treat their religious beliefs. So it's not like people think, well, I've got these religious beliefs, but they're conditional on the science ending up turning out in a particular way. You think, well, that's not really how people think about religion, right? I mean, there's some interaction with scientific discovery, but it's not like it stands or falls on whatever scientists are doing at the moment. I think, look, maybe free will and responsibility are beliefs that people treat in a similar way. We think that's one way to interpret the results that we've gotten here. Okay. That's it. So thanks so much for your attention.
Well, there was terrific questions. She's the first.
Hi. Do you think a choice depends on how do you feel, and a suggestion I think the main word would be, the key word would be suggestion, manipulates a spectrum of response. Well, a choice depends on how you feel. You think that, and a suggestion manipulates the response.
So which response would be?
It's a spectrum when you create a suggestion.
So I'm not entirely sure I understand the suggestion, but is the idea that we didn't look at how the fictionalized participants in the experiment felt, or so that's the feeling of the fictionalized agents, or is it the feeling of the participants in our studies that you're thinking are the thing we should explore? That's the part I can't tell. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So are we supposed to ask our participants how they feel about the studies, or are we supposed to build in information about how the participants in the studies felt, the studies that they're reading? So this was, by the way, this thing of having participants that are reading about participants was a constantly pain to make it right in a paper. I mean, it was like, oh my God. Anyway, yes. I'm not sure. But to think, maybe we can talk afterwards. Oh yeah, sorry. Maybe we can talk afterwards. And because I'm not entirely sure how we would do it.
Well, it's kind of like surprise.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, sorry.
You know,
one way to think about this is like what we did before, asking about surprise. But then there could be other attitudes that people feel that might explain why, or that might help us differentiate responses people are having. Is that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can't.
for hello, hello, hello. Yes. Perfect. Sorry, Peter, please.
Just a methodological thing. I mean, a null result is tricky because you don't know if there is no difference in reality, or you fail to find a difference that does exist.
Yeah.
And so, like, how do you know that these MTurk people are taking your vignettes seriously and not just clicking things randomly? I mean, they just want to make money, presumably, right? So how do you have any sort of internal check? So often people will add something like a catch trial, like they'll add a sentence that's utterly unrelated, like, Minnie Mouse is wearing a pink dress or something.
Yeah.
And at the end, did they actually read that? What color was her dress? And if that is true, then you take their answer seriously. Otherwise, you throw the subject out. Did you have internal checks?
So, well, there's a couple things. So, one, because this had an open response item, that was one easy way to catch people that weren't going to that we could tell weren't playing along. But then the second one, or just wrote nonsense, right? Like bzz, yeah. But then, or things where it was like, because there's also now people using ChatGPT to try to automate doing these things. So you can tell sometimes when it's like, Alice sat down for tea at around 3 p.m. It's like, okay, you're not doing this. But then we also throw out anybody who finished the task in less than half of the median time. So for all of these, so if the median completion time was, say, 120 seconds, we throw out anybody who completed the survey in 60 seconds or less as a way to catch people who were just clicking through. So that's not perfect because we didn't have that catch trial, but we did have some things that were trying to catch people who were just blitzing through.
Okay, Eddie.
Oh, edgy.
I mean, I'm a little surprised that there are no results, and I'll look more closely at the primes and things. I mean, my initial, or the what you're giving them, what is that called? The stimuli.
Yeah.
But I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, my first reaction is they're not believing or understanding what the studies are about. My intuition is that they're more difficult to understand than determinism, but either way, they might both be impossible for most people to understand. So just remind us how. So in the first study, you've got these things about percentages, and nobody knows what that means, right? I mean, so 55% versus 20% in the control condition. But then in the second one, you basically told them. How did you? What was the stimuli that said this is the thing that caused him to cheat or to whatever? You just said it.
Yeah. We didn't put it up on the screen, but it was essentially in that last paragraph. We just said, John cheated because he was told to think about his goals. Yeah. He wasn't aware that this was why he cheated, and when the experimenters told him about it afterwards, he didn't believe them.
Yeah.
So
just explicitly baking.
To be fair, in one sense, you're lying to them because you don't know whether or not that caused John, that particular participant. That's one problem with the studies, of course. You never know whether one individual subject was influenced by the prime.
Well,
it's
no,
always
we're just stipulating. I mean, we're
no,
the
that's what I
authors
mean. So you're lying to them in the sense that you're stipulating something that the experiments couldn't show. That's not a critique. I'm just
You call me a liar, Eddie?
No. So, but it's related to why I was saying they wouldn't understand it if you didn't tell them, because from the percentages, you can't. And this has been some people's response to the situation is stuff like, and maybe it's an intrusion effect. They're just saying, yeah, but you can't tell for any given subject whether they were influenced by the prime and whether they're not good.
The way we would have done that, but like it created its own problems, was to make it 100%.
Yeah, exactly.
And
which
then
would be bullshit too.
Yeah.
And nobody would believe
So
it.
we went with 92% because we thought that was like a compromise of how far we could go.
So
to, we
upped
did
the
92.
percentages.
Yeah, sure. To 92%.
92%.
92. Correct.
Jennifer.
Dispositions just don't care, man.
So, as I was watching this, I was trying to imagine myself as one of your MTurkers. And I mean, these kinds of suggestions, they're kind of weird, right? To believe and to swallow. So I'm in camp. Maybe your MTurkers were not like buying the prime, and so if I was trying to think, okay, I read that. What do I do first? I think, interesting. Can that be true? And then I measure it against my own intuitions about my own thinking, and I'm thinking, okay, I find the dime. Well, how would that make me behave and feel? So I'm wondering if these people are answering for the participant in the vignette, or instead you're getting the answer about what, in essence, what they think is true about the prime by examining their own behavior and self. And so they're going to be way more defensive of free will and, and agency and stuff.
I mean, maybe we could have, one way to maybe getting at that, we could have asked them to imagine at the end of it all that they were the one in the experiment, and whether or not, I mean, maybe there's a way of doing that to try to pull them apart. I think maybe we could do that.
Well, you might get another null result. You might get that, in fact, they do that for the first time, thinking they're answering for John, but really giving their own answer about themselves. And you ask them, okay, well, how would you answer for yourself? Well, you get the same thing. So I don't know. I wonder if there's some other way to try to get at their process of reasoning in terms of the extent to which they accept your prime.
Yeah, I think we'd hoped that the reliability thing was a way of doing that, at least, because we wanted to make sure that they at least thought that the science was believable. But you're right, even if they think it's believable, when they internalize it, yeah.
But notice that also kind of supports the conclusion we offered at the end, which was, giving people these experiments. This evidence doesn't really challenge. I mean, maybe they get threatened in a way, but it doesn't really challenge the beliefs, because they just have a way of shifting the basis for making these attributions. So,
I mean, the next thing to try might be to give them. So Doris's passage, first of all, was way too long, complicated, and the stuff
just
about
as long as the Crick.
I don't really like that one either. But what Doris isn't really doing there, and what you might try doing, is just giving them the argument.
Yeah. By the way, I thought of that when I was reading the Doris thing this time.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the results about state names and stuff are bullshit too, because of not that. I mean, first of all, I don't know how strong they are, but when it says there's an 82% higher chance of George becoming a gynecologist, that just means compared to base rates. That doesn't mean that like 82% of people named George are becoming gynecologists. So it's just hard to understand that. So you just need to give them a very short argument that explains, like, people aren't aware of what's causing them to cheat, and yet they cheated. So it seems like they're being influenced by something that they couldn't have controlled because they weren't aware of it. Maybe it's just those two sentences.
Now, because you could do it two ways. You could just write something that was more like Doris, but not in that way, that was just sort of giving the arguments. Or you're suggesting at the bottom, like after you give the John thing, you say like some researchers or whatever, one conclusion many scientists draw from this sort of research is precisely because of this. I mean, maybe that would be at the end of the stimuli. It wouldn't be its own you wouldn't have like it would be like a vignette plus argument thing. Yeah, maybe.
Someone from the online audience wants to ask something.
Okay.
Or no, I'm just asking.
Oh.
Is there someone there that will? No. No. Okay. Renato.
Okay, thank you both. One thing that we have been seeing here in our experiments of this sort is that people really struggle to understand texts that are, a bit longer. I mean, in Brazil, we know this plays a big role in a lot of discrepancies. I would like to know, how much do you think this is part of it? And, your crowd is well educated. Did you control for that? Used to reading, not used to reading?
No, I mean, we could use ChatGPT to dumb them down. I mean, in a way, like to make them in a easier to digest vocabulary. I mean, that's an easier thing to do. So maybe that's a possibility. I don't know how much the thing is, I don't know how short you can, I mean, the Doors thing is longer. I don't know how short you can make them and still give all the information. It's like kind of hard to describe a study and the results and everything else in just a paragraph or two anyway. So I don't know how how much leaner we could get them. But it is a worry. I mean, here again, this is related to what you did. I mean, would video vignettes be better? I mean, I don't know. Maybe
Yeah, we could try video, like a video presentation.
I think the video is much more intuitive.
But at this point, this is by the way, this is just a point about how psychology goes, and like philosophers underestimate how this works sometimes. I mean, as he already said, I mean, we probably run this on 5,000 participants, even at paying MTurk prices. I'm a philosopher. I don't have like a giant research budget or huge grants. Like this costs thousands of dollars, you know, like already to have a series of null effects. So now we think, oh yeah, right, let's get a videographer and let's do all this. Like, sure, yeah, right. But now we have to track down a videographer who wants to do it for free. So it's not that I don't think it's a good idea. It's just that this is a case where philosophers working in isolation, and Sam's as much a psychologist as he is a philosopher. I'm not, I guess, but like we just don't have the resources. Like we have to. This is one where to do something like that, we would have to pair up with psychologists who had research budgets or grants and something like. I just don't know how else to, you know. So we're already multiple studies in, all null effects. Like even if we did it with the video, it's like the paper's going to read as here are the 11 studies, and then that's all null. And we got it on this 12th study that we had to spend $10,000 on. I mean, this is just the difficulty of it. I think you're absolutely right. I would love to do it. I'm not saying I won't do it. It's just that we need volunteers. Any of you guys have?
We're gonna pass around a hat.
Well,
But we did have Fleisch reading scores, you know, which are imperfect, but they came out at about a 10th grade reading level for all these materials. So it's, you know, they're not improbably difficult.
But you control for the education of the participants.
We
Do
don't do
they
that. We do
show?
that, but we
Okay.
checked kind of like what the comprehension levels needed to read the vignettes, and they're not very high. But we
Yeah.
should control for the
Yeah.
education, so that's a good idea.
So this reminds me, and from Jennifer's comment, is this on?
Yeah.
So, I mean, what you might be able to do is something that I thought social psychologists should have been doing when they're doing these experiments, which is do the experiments with the subjects and then do the debriefing and make the free will stuff come up during the debriefing, especially if you can kind of do it in some, like you could do some cool things, like have groups of 10 subjects doing the experiments at a given time, and then they come out and you say, okay, so you 8 cheated on that and you 2 didn't cheat, and you 8 got the prime and you 2 didn't get the prime. So do you think the prime had any effect on your behavior? See what they say. Did you know the prime had any effect? See what they say. And then say, do you feel like you controlled your behavior? Try some free will stuff and see if they'll still resist and be like, yep, I still controlled my behavior, even though you're showing me that I'm in the group that cheated and these 2 people didn't cheat, and the only difference. Yeah, anyway, something like that could be really cool. And then you could just suggest it to some social psychologists who are doing this shit on their own dime, and you don't have to pay for it.
We primed you for that dime comment, Eddie.
And I really did think he was going to fall off the stage the whole time. I was paying more attention.
Who else? Questions? Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. A big round of applause for Thomas Nadelhoffer and Sam Murray.